So you'll notice on your tables you have communion elements. We will get to that by the end of the teaching today. And just a note on that, communion is open for all of you today. Don't care where you're at theologically, you're free to take it. And even if the only reason you're taking it today is because you really want to taste that almond cracker, that's fine with me. There are greater depths to it that we'll talk about. This communion element, we historically have looked at it primarily through a lens of forgiveness, and certainly it does communicate that, but it also communicates more than that. And so we'll take a look at that primary way of thinking about it, but then we'll also look at a definite major other way of thinking about it as well by the time we get to the end of the teaching. So anyway, look forward to that, and it's open to everybody, but we'll take it together, so it's not like chips and salsa right now is what I'm getting at. Just hold off on that, all right? Okay, so today we're talking about Daniel chapter 3, and as we get into this, hopefully you've figured out that I'm taking one chapter at a time. We're going to end up going through the first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel, which was very meaningful stuff for the Jewish people. And the reason why it was so meaningful for them is because they were oppressed for most of their history. They had a couple hundred years-ish where they had their own country and called their own shots. And then not long after Solomon was king, which was David's son, then all of a sudden you had some real problems, and things fell apart. The kingdom was divided. That made them extremely vulnerable. A couple hundred years after that or so, then they were overrun by the Babylonians, and then it became one kingdom after another, after another, after another. And they were never their own people, and they were under oppression of another world leader. And so the book of Daniel, particularly the first 6 chapters were stories that were told around campfires, around the battlefield, over centuries of time, remembering what happened to these 4 Jewish young men, one in particular, Daniel, but then his comrades, who we mostly know as Shadrach, Meschach, and Abednego, but they had Hebrew names, which you'll see by the end of today's story. And the ancient Israelites would hear these stories as hopeful words from people who were under oppression, and the reason they were hopeful is because they were under oppression the whole time. And I need to let you know that as context, because for most of us here today, we have a very hard time relating to what was actually happening for them. And the reason why we have such a hard time relating is most of us here today hail from the United States. This is our home country, and the United States is a superpower in the world, and in terms of military might and economics, probably the greatest superpower in the world right now. And we all have enjoyed the comforts and the freedoms that provides. That is not the experience of the ancient Israelites. They have no idea what we're enjoying right now, because for them, this kind of religious freedom and other types of freedoms that we take for granted, they were not afforded. And so we're going to see that reminded again. And just want to remind you, sometimes when I say words like, well, these were folk tales from a very long time ago, some take offense at that, like, what are you telling me, that Daniel, Shadrach, and Meschach, and Abednego never existed? And I'm saying, well, I don't know, I guess so, maybe. I mean, you can't really say yes or no, but what I want to tell you is that the truth of the stories is not necessarily in the historicity of the stories, of the actual factuality of it, but the truth of the stories is what is communicated in the stories themselves. That's where the power is. And so don't get hung up on the details, because there are anachronisms in all 6 stories that give us pause, and they're really a nod from Jewish scholars saying, well, this is why we think that they were embellished on purpose, and that's not a bad thing. So you need to hear it as the story that it is. And I am having trouble getting my slides to come up. Nope, that's not it. Let me do one more. Well, it's showing, woo-hoo. All right, we got it. All right, good deal. So you're going to look at some words on the screen in a moment. Right now, I just want you to hear the story. So I'm going to read you Daniel chapter 3. It's not that long. It's a cool story. It's the story of Shadrach, Meschach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. How many of you know that story already? So what is interesting to me, last night I was at a birthday party. One of my childhood friends had his 50th birthday party, and some other childhood friends from my days in the Kansas City area were there with me. And when one of them asked me, what am I teaching on today, and I said this story, there wasn't an immediate recollection of this story. I had a couple experiences like that recently. A few weeks ago, I did a renewal of vow ceremony for some friends of ours in Fairfield. And I read as part of my little homily 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter. And what was so fascinating to me as a kid who grew up in church is nobody in the audience had any idea what I was talking about. They'd never heard it before. And the more that we move forward in our country and the trajectory that we're on, when I say things like, oh, well, let's start your memorial service with Psalm 23, they kind of look at me with a blank look. What's a psalm and what's the 23 about? That's the culture that we live in. So if you are unfamiliar with this story, that's all right. You're not going to be very much longer. And then you can hold it over people, right? Because that's the point. All right, anyway, let's go. So King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. So you need to think the outlet mall sign over there, think twice that height. That's the height you need. And think more like a Washington Monument shaped thing rather than a statue. And you remember last week when we looked at Daniel 2, Nebuchadnezzar had this weird dream of a statue with a head of gold, silver, bronze, iron, and then feet of iron and clay. And so probably what the scholars are thinking is he had this crazy dream where he actually looked pretty good in the dream. And so now he's thinking, well, I'm just going to go ahead and make a monument to myself. So this is a guy making a monument to himself, probably reflected him. Then he sent messages to the high officers, officials, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the provincial officials to come to the dedication of the statue he had set up. So all these officials came and stood before the statue King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald shouted out, "People of all races and nations and languages, listen to the king's command. When you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and other musical instruments, bow to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. Anyone who refuses to obey him will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." So this gives us a little picture on that ancient world. This is a dictator. This is a megalomaniac who wields absolute power over his people. Life and death are in his hands. You don't do what he says, there's a good chance you are going to die. That's the flavor you need to have. This is not, this is not going down to Cabo San Lucas for a little adventure and it's just a new place, new culture and all that. Nope, this is no vacation for any Jews who might be here. This is serious stuff. And the other thing, this is just kind of a theological, biblical nerd moment, but there are two words in Hebrew that can be translated as the one English word worship. One has theological connotation as if you're in a cultic practice worshiping a deity, and the other is bowing down in homage to something. The bowing down to homage of something is the one we're talking about here. Sometimes the English translation doesn't help us much in that. I know that's a nerd moment, but it's kind of helpful, and hopefully it's just one more thing to hold over your friends. So anyway, let's go on. So at the sound of the musical instruments, all the people, whatever their race or nation or language, bowed to the ground and worshiped the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. But some of the astrologers went to the king and informed on the Jews. They narked on the Jews is what they're doing. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "Long live the king. You issued a decree requiring all the people to bow down and worship the gold statue when they hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and other musical instruments. That decree also states that those who refuse to obey must be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews, Shadrach, Meschach, and Abednego, whom you have put in charge of the province of Babylon. They pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue you have set up. Now, this is an interesting thing. Not only are they telling on these three Jewish guys, but they're also kind of criticizing Nebuchadnezzar, because Nebuchadnezzar is the one that elevated them in the first place. And so it's a little bit of a punch in the nose on Nebuchadnezzar. It's kind of a red-faced moment for Nebuchadnezzar. He put his trust in these guys because of some things that already happened, and now it's coming back on him. So he's embarrassed about it. And it's this awkward moment. Then Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and ordered that Shadrach, Meschach, and Abednego be brought before him. When they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meschach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship the gold statue I have set up? I'll give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I have made when you hear the sound of the musical instruments. But if you refuse, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to rescue from my power?" Shadrach, Meschach, and Abednego replied, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't," oh, I love those words, "but even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up." What a statement of faith. So we think God is going to deliver us, but even if God doesn't, we're going to not worship your gods because we believe this is the right thing to do. Because it's the right thing to do. Love that. Hold on to that. So Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meschach, and Abednego that his face became distorted with rage. He commanded that the furnace be heated up 7 times hotter than usual. Then he ordered some of the strongest men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meschach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So they tied them up and threw them into the furnace, fully dressed in their pants, turbans, robes, and other garments. And because the king, in his anger, had demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames killed the soldiers as they threw the 3 men in. So Shadrach, Meschach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames. It's a nice children's story, isn't it, so far? Oh my gosh. We have children's songs about this. Like, oh, okay. But moving on. But suddenly, Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, "Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace?" "Yes, your majesty, we certainly did," they replied. "Look," Nebuchadnezzar shouted, "I see 4 men unbound walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a god." Then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meschach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out here." So Shadrach, Meschach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Then the high officers, officials, governors, and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their heads was singed, and their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell of smoke. Interesting side note here, something that's not noted, but it's right there in front of us. There is something that did burn on them in that fire, and that was the ropes that were used to tie them. Interesting little nerd moment there for you. But what does that say? That the ropes of the enemy were burned up, but nothing else. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, what a switch. "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meschach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own. Therefore, I make this decree. If any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meschach, and Abednego, they will be torn limb from limb, and their houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. There is no other God who can rescue like this. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to even higher positions in the province of Babylon. Now you've heard the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the fiery furnace. What an interesting story. This story has been put to music. As you were coming in today, I cycled 4 videos that just kind of span time. The first one, if you were here right at the beginning, Beastie Boys, can you believe it, from the 1980s? Oh my gosh, had a song called Shadrach, and it refers to this. How trippy is that? I had no idea. So you have that, then you've got 2 jazz greats, one guy named Somebody Ford and Louis Armstrong from about the same era. A really snappy tune, pretty cool. I'll give you links to these in my blog today if you want to go listen to them for yourself. And then Johnny Cash in the 1970s with the hair and everything. He sings this great song about the 4th man in the fire, and sort of a nod to we're never alone. You know, God is with us even through the fire, and this kind of a thing. Really cool. VeggieTales, which is a kid's cartoon thing. They've vegetized the story. There were no roasted tomatoes, harmed in this thing. And so this is super popular. And I know there's kids' versions of the songs about this thing. And, it's a little bit troubling because there are very violent stories in the Old Testament that they kind of end positive, and so we just let's turn it into a children's song. And so we teach our kid these things and don't realize that we're also maybe really exposing them to some really horrible things as well, which was the tyranny of King Nebuchadnezzar in this. And we really got 2 things to play with here. We have this issue of worshiping idols, which we're going to look into, and then we have another issue of their behavior as they chose not to worship idols. How did they choose to move forward in an oppressive regime in a way that they thought honored their faith tradition? And we're going to see how both of these things actually have relevance. Now, in some respects, this was not a difficult decision for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It was very difficult because they knew that if they chose not to bow down, they were going to die. It was very likely that was going to happen. So that part, not so easy. But to make the distinguishing difference between what they were being asked and what they actually believed, that part was easy. Because one of the 10 commandments is, you shall have no other gods before me, period. So for them to worship an idol of, a seeming deity, and Nebuchadnezzar probably saw himself as a deity, as a lot of oppressors did back then, as a megalomaniac, that's what you do. They knew immediately what was before them, and they decided this is in direct violation to one of the top 10s. There's no way we can fudge around this. There's no nuance here. This is just pure and simple. If we're Jewish people, if we really claim to be of the Jewish tribe and we believe the 10 commandments, we're not doing that. And so for them, it was a done deal. It wasn't an issue, even if their life was on the line. I do love their faith, where they say, we think God is big enough, strong enough to do this, but their faith really showed up in that follow-up statement. But even if God doesn't deliver us and we die, we're not going to bow down to you because we still believe in our faith. And no amount of threat on your part is going to mess with us on that. Well, the problem is, in some situations today, in our culture, it's not always so simple. It's also complicated. I love our country. I love what our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution afford us. And yet at the same time, I'm troubled by the realities of our own history in our country, because we've sort of celebrated, at least in vernacular and in our own U.S. mythology of our own past, we've sort of celebrated us as the good guys and even a Christian nation in some respects. And yet there are some very unchristian things that are part of our past that are very difficult for me to reconcile. And I think it's at least safe to say, and I don't think there's going to be too many people that would really challenge this, that there have been some dark moments in our history where even though we might have been thinking of ourselves as a Christian nation, there were definitely some moments where the behavior of our country looked nothing like Jesus. So let's just start from the very beginning. This won't take long. But a couple glaring examples, like when some of the early settlers came over to flee religious persecution in Europe, their idea was, we don't want any religious persecution here so long as you're Christian, doing it our kind of way. So if you're Native American and you're practicing your indigenous religion, well, we're not going to have that. And so there was freedom, kind of, as long as you stuck within the boundaries. And that kind of stuck for a very long time. It's still kind of stuck here. And there are some things that weren't so pleasant. The mistreatment of Native Americans in our country, horrific. There's no Jesus in that. I mean, I think about, Jesus going into Samaria, and as soon as he saw the Samaritan woman, he slaughtered her. No, that's not the story at all. He had a conversation with her. I think about all the times when he went and reached out to the other, and not just Jesus, but that's evidenced in the Old Testament as well. So I think about American slavery. How can you not? The worst form of slavery the world has seen, and we created it, we perfected it, and we even used the Bible to promote it. And interestingly, you need to know this because this is fascinating, that some scholars who do work on Daniel, they want to paint a pretty picture of the life that Shadrach, Meschach, and Abednego and Daniel were experiencing. And one of the reasons why they wanted to do that, in retrospect, is because if we can look at how they were treated and tell ourselves that they had a pleasant experience and maybe better than they would have otherwise, then in a weird way it justifies our behavior when we do the same thing. Does that make any sense? So if we look back and say, it wasn't so bad for them, we can also, by extension, say to ourselves, gosh, it really wasn't that bad for those African people that we purchased from other African people to come and be our slaves over here. It wasn't so bad. In fact, we need to feel good about it because we saved them from certainly a terrible future in their home country, and instead, their ancestors are now in the United States. So we can really feel good about it. But we can't feel good about it. There's no Jesus in American slavery. There's no Jesus in that environment. And we got to live with that. And, we get into World War II, and we entered into it, and this is the part where I'm probably going to start stepping on some toes, and I don't mean to. All I want to do, I'm getting to a place where I just want you to start asking questions of yourself and how we see things and how we interpret our own history and how do we hold that tension with being a so-called Christian nation and us being Christians, and how do we then feel about it? How do we tell ourselves the stories? What do we celebrate? What don't we celebrate? All these things. Because unless we do, I think we may run into a problem where we end up worshiping some idols unawares. And so the way the battle ended, the way the war ended with Japan anyway, was with a couple of bombs that we dropped. And when we drop those bombs, a lot of times when you hear people talk about this, especially around holidays that celebrate our military might, by far we have the biggest, baddest military the world has ever seen. And so sometimes we think about that and the flexing of muscle that happened when we dropped nuclear bombs on Japan. And while we're celebrating that power, I think we fail to remember that tens of thousands of children and women and elderly were wiped out in a flash. In a flash. A fiery furnace that we dropped. And that the disease that nuclear experience happened for generations to come was also us. And so I know that ended a war, and I know that war sucks, and that when it gets to that point, it's defending people. I understand all that, but it's not satisfactory. We've got to look at our own history and say, how have our hands been bloodied? Then when we go on and we think about some civil rights issues that were fought in really ugly ways all throughout the 1900s and are still being waged today in different ways, you just got to look at it. And you just got to ask yourself, okay, so we want to be the good guys. We want to, in some ways, even kind of talk about being a Christian nation, sort of-ish, but boy, there are sure times where in our history and even in our present, it just doesn't look a lot like Jesus. I think owning that is really important. Not as a precursor or a first step toward hating our country, but maybe as an important step as Jesus people to actually help our country and to actually stand firm in our faith. Because we haven't always been pretty. And we haven't always looked like Jesus. And it's still true today. We still have idols that are around us. I gave you some really easy ones to pick at, but there are everyday issues that are also easily recognizable if we'll step back and just ask questions about what we're seeing. And my whole point with you today is to get you to ask questions about what you're seeing. Because there's a laundry list of issues. Let me just rattle off a few. And you can feel free to add to this list if you want. Let's see if I can find my long laundry list. Oh yeah, here it is. So I'm really asking the question about your primary allegiance. Where does it lie? Is it really with God, as understood in our Christian context as through the lens of Jesus, who is everlastingly graceful and loving and forgiving, or is it to something else? And so I'm asking, where does your primary allegiance lie? The United States? The U.S. military? Donald Trump? The GOP? The DNC? Prison reform? Gender? How do you determine your stance on the following issues? Immigration, Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, LGBTQ rights, healthcare, global warming, income inequality, public education, taxation, prison reform, oh, I already did that, housing affordability, civility, and I'm wondering what else would you add to the list? Where does our primary allegiance lie? And I fear that, and this has been substantiated by scholars for a long time, that particularly our relationship between church and politics has gotten really weird. There's a guy who wrote a book about 9 years ago or so. His name's George Hunter, and he wrote a book called To Change the World. And what he said is that what's happened in America, politics and religion, primarily Christian religion, is you've got the Republican Party, and right alongside with the Republican Party are conservative Christians. And then you've got the Democratic Party, and right alongside them are progressive Christians. And you know what he calls both the conservative Christians and the progressive Christians in relation to both political parties? The useful idiots. We're patted on the back just enough to feel like we're really making a difference, but in reality, it's going the other way around. We just become pawns in a game that we shouldn't be playing in the same kind of way. So my question is not to offend you or to frustrate you or to challenge your military sensibilities necessarily or your past. Don't hear that. But do hear the question, how are we faced with modern day idols all the time? And how are we choosing to live as people who claim to follow Jesus? And then in retrospect, where have we failed? Where have we nailed it? So there's this great quote. This is what I do want to bring on the screen for you, because this is one of the scholars that I looked at this week. And so let's just check this out. Christian faith involves the refusal to bow before the golden statues of Nebuchadnezzar. But what is critical in the modern era is the realization that in our time, Nebuchadnezzar is now perfectly capable of building his statues with the face of Jesus. Evil appears as an angel of light. And he gives an example of a U.S. nuclear submarine capable of dozens of Hiroshimas named Corpus Christi, which translates Body of Christ. So this is the submarine that they're talking about. It was built in the 80s, so it's probably going to come offline in the near future because its technology is kind of old. But this one vehicle alone carries way more military horsepower than how we ended our war with Japan in World War II. Now, I understand I understand to some degree the naming of ships and different naval vessels, and that they name these particular types of vessels after cities. So technically, it's the USS City of Corpus Christi. But don't you think, don't you think there was somebody, who was paying attention to language, and instead of, hey, let's call it the body of Christ, why don't we name one after Topeka, Kansas or something, right? Do you see the tension that a war machine is named, even if it's after a city, still a war machine capable of destroying, a lot of the earth is named the body of Christ. And we don't even notice. And now I was told by a new crosswalker who worked on and built modern-day submarines, and says that one of our submarines now can destroy the entire world. One can destroy the entire world. I mean, on the one hand, that's impressive as a military machine, but on the other hand, what do we do with that as Jesus people who want to value life and want to value others and see others as neighbor and brother and sister? Well, he goes on to talk. It says, for Americans who believe that they live in a Christian country, it is far too easy to accept political or economic policies that involve bowing to golden statues in the name of national interests. The bombing of Baghdad during the Persian Gulf War resulted in thousands of civilian deaths and continued to wreak havoc for the poor of that society years after the ceasefire, through the destruction of a vital infrastructure for distribution of medical supplies, food, water, and other essentials of peaceful existence. Yet the bombing was accompanied by a political rhetoric of faith and patriotism that played as sweetly on international television as did Nebuchadnezzar's orchestra. But the Christian is called to resistance and to atheism in the face of all false gods. In other words, the atheism is not to our God that we understand, but atheism to political things and other false gods that there are. If chapter 1 of Daniel was a call to resist the enticements of the king's food and wine, chapter 3 is just as clearly a call not to lose heart before the sight of the monumental self-importance of the conquering regime, both then and now. Modern Christians ought to refuse all attempts to serenade violence and exploitation with the tunes of patriotism. Ouch, oh, that hurts, because we've been guilty of it. It is precisely the responsibility of Christians to point out the falsehoods of using Christian symbolism and language to defend exploitation and military brutality. The beginning of that task, however, is for us to refuse to be moved by the music of national interest. Oh my gosh, this is potent stuff. What do we do with that? And then Mishael, Azariah, and Hananiah then, these are their Hebrew names, by the way. The commentator at least has the dignity of using their Hebrew names. Mishael, Azariah, and Hananiah then are Hebrew apostles of a radical faith that is, at the same time, a political atheism. My goal is not to offend you today or to have all the answers. My goal is to bother you as an agent of God. That the Spirit of God, which is bothering me and bothers us all the time, would bother you with this tension. That it is very difficult in some cases to justify some of the things that we are about, and at the same time not voice out what is the way of Jesus. And just on one note, and again, I'm not picking on anybody, but I heard this really disturbing statistic this week, and they compared it to about 50 years ago when the Civil Rights Movement was happening. When the Civil Rights Movement was happening, and there was a lot of political activism and a lot of desire for change and gatherings and so on and so forth, about 60% or so of American people had confidence that our American government on the federal level could actually make something happen. 60%. You know what that number is now? 17%. 17%. I'm also troubled by the fact that these two religious groups that I was telling about and their respective political parties, both conservatives, progressives, Republicans, and Democrats. I'm concerned that when Democratic and Republican leaders use language that degrades people, defames people, is in no way reflective of Jesus. That the parties that are the religious groups that are with them are silent. When are the people of Jesus going to raise a hand and say to the people who are saying horrible things to other American people, enough is enough? I may agree with your political platform, but cut this stuff out because you're killing America and you're giving license to the same kind of religious speak and intolerance to other people. It is no surprise that there is an uptick in very violent language in the last several years because our petitions use violent language of other people. How have we bowed down to the idols of today? On the political front, on the economic front, on the military front, on social justice. But luckily, I'm going to be done talking about that for now. So the pressure's off. But now I want to shift gears a little bit to something that's quite surprising. And that is to look at what Shadrach, Meschach, and Abednego did and what it resulted in. Remember who we're talking about here? Nebuchadnezzar, megalomaniac, guy who thinks he's God, wields his power around, makes an edict, expects people to follow it. If they don't, they kill him, and he has no problem doing that. He just proved that with Shadrach, Meschach, and Abednego, at least the attempt of this thing. That's who we're talking about. Because of Shadrach, Meschach, and Abednego's action, which was not to insult Nebuchadnezzar, not to call him all the names that they'd certainly been called, not to rally a call for anybody with a sword to come and let's take this punk. Nothing like that. They just simply stated, we believe our God is able to deliver us from this, but even if God doesn't, we're not going to do what you want, because what you're asking us to do is directly in violation of our relationship covenant with God. So we're not going to do it. And they stopped talking. Well, they got thrown in the fire. We know how that story works. The presence of God, that's that fourth character. There's been lots of commentary about who was that, what was that. Just know, in general, presence of God is enough to know, protecting them. And they got out of the fire. And then what happened? What was the result of that action? Nebuchadnezzar changed his mind. The megalomaniac changed his mind. He changed the law. And even went beyond that. He protected the freedom and the ongoing life of Jewish people altogether. You know what we call that? We call that nonviolent. We call that a nonviolent approach to power. You know what's interesting about this? Again, this is difficult for us to realize, even though in our country we've certainly seen change happen as a result of nonviolent action. To change our civil rights, for example. But still, we're the superpower. Still, we are the country in the world with the most muscle. And so our natural go-to is very easily, sometimes at least, to go to threat and use our power to try to coerce people to do things. That's our MO in a lot of situations. But that's not the case here. In fact, one scholar who I'm going to be sharing with you quite a bit in the next month, this guy named Ronald Sider, from his book, If Jesus is Lord, he says, a recent scholarly book examined all the known cases, 323, of both major armed and unarmed insurrections from 1900 to 2006, and discovered an amazing result. Nonviolent resistance campaigns were nearly twice as likely to achieve full or partial success as their violent counterparts. In other words, following in the footsteps of Shadrach, Meschach, and Abednego, choosing to follow in the footsteps of Jesus, who was all about that and modeled it throughout his life, actually works almost twice as effectively as violence. So I'm wondering what that means for us in a nation and a world that needs Jesus-type people to stand up. I wonder what difference it might make if you and I, because of the love of God on us, we choose to be love to the world around us, to stand up with love for those that are crying out in their oppression and not being treated with dignity and respect. I wonder what would happen if we, as the people who are trying to embody love because we've been so loved, I wonder how that would impact absolutely everything about the world that we live in. I wonder if we'd be willing to give it a try. I've given you a lot to think about, and in case you were wondering what to think about, here are some questions for you. Like, who or what are today's Nebuchadnezzars, and who or what are we being demanded to honor? And what price do we pay if we don't bow down to these things? And what is the potential of such nonviolent action of not bowing down? And what does our communion mean in light of Daniel 3, which takes us to communion? Because communion, if you grew up in a tradition that saw this primarily, this is most of American Christianity, saw this as a symbol of forgiveness of sin. Go ahead and grab a cracker and a juice from your thing. We recognize this as a symbol of the cross of Jesus, where his body was broken, his blood was shed, and the most popularized version of this way of understanding Christianity is that on the cross we see the forgiveness of sin. A final sacrifice was made for us. That gets a little cloudy because there are some first century realities that don't resonate with us so much anymore, but we can share what this represents with our first century brothers and sisters and say, at the end of the day, this means that we're okay with God, that God loves us, that that's the most important thing to God. And I think that's still true. But that wasn't the only thing it meant for the early church. For them to take communion also meant it wasn't just a word of affirmation and thanksgiving for the love of God, but it also was to take a stand and say, I am standing with Jesus, and I am willing to share even in the sacrifice of Jesus with my very being, if necessary, because it's right. So with that, if you're in that space, right, and if you are uncomfortable with that, but you just want to taste the cracker, no judgment. We don't have any radars in here to understand your will or where you're at with that, but you know, our lives are messy. Some parts of our lives we know we're nailing it in terms of our walk with God and following Jesus, and other parts we know we struggle. Taking this today as a reminder that we're loved anyway by God, and it's also a statement, a confession, a commitment to say to God, I want to do the best I can to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. So if that's where you are, then I invite you now to take and eat the cracker. The cracker is to remind us of a broken body because Jesus was severely beaten before he was executed. The cup of a new covenant, but the color of it is no mistake. Ancient wine of the day, now it's just grape juice for us. But it's to remind us of blood that was shed, to remind us that what we're being called to is serious and may have ramifications for us on a sacrificial level. But we know we've been loved, and we know the way to go forward. And so if you want to join that way with Jesus, then take and drink the cup. Let's pray together. So God, who knew that a story that was so meaningful to oppressed Jewish people for centuries, giving them hope and direction on how to live under the tyranny of a regime that did not honor you, who knew that it would still be so relevant today? God, I am confident that it is possible to love our country, to want to stand for its best principles and also follow you. But I confess that it is challenging at times, and sometimes I've blown it, we've blown it. Today, God, may we be reminded of what it can look like to be present, faithful, strong, in a Jesus kind of way. For our sake, our faith, our life, and truly the sake of the world. May we be found to be faithful. In Jesus' name, amen.